Hey MMA fans, Cage Minds, Micah Frankel, back with a recap and results show from UFC on FX4. There were 12 matchups to talk about. Let's get right to it. First one, we'll start off with Dustin Page versus Ken Stone. We predicted Dustin Page to win this fight with a submission. First two rounds were back and forth with striking. In the third round, Ken Stone was finally able to get a takedown, get the top position in a transition. Off of a Dustin Page attempted body lock takedown, Ken Stone rides out the top of the rest of the third round in the top position. A split decision comes down, and Ken Stone edges out Dustin Page in a hard-fought bantamweight battle. Next, we go on to Ricardo Funch versus Dan Miller in a welterweight battle. We had picked Miller to win this fight because of his grappling paralysis wrestling. We thought would be the defining edge in getting him the top position. Possibly Funch's lack of being able to take a punch would come into it, and we thought that Miller would win with his improved stand-up. Third round TKO. It did end in the third round, but it was Dan Miller with a guillotine. He attempted it several times, and Funch was working for takedowns, and the last time it works, Dan Miller impressive in his debut at welterweight. Next matchup, we move on to Luis Ramos versus Matt Brown. We are predicted for Brown to win this fight by decision. He's the brawler. He'll be up in his face and keeping the sturdy for Ramos. Brown brawling, keeping it close, doing what he has to do first round, second round, fighting off takedowns, getting in with that clinch. As soon as he's starting to land the knees, the elbows, punches, just a barrage of strikes. We have a standing up stop by the ref as Ramos was starting to not defend himself, saved the fighter. Matt Brown, a second round TKO victory. That's 3 consecutive this year for Matt Brown. Next matchup, Nicotone versus Chris Camozzi. This fight is where the card starts getting interesting. First 2 rounds, very close, but in the last minute of each round, Nicotone would get a takedown and would finish the round on top. So even me, as the announcers were calling it, you could feel with those late takedowns that both rounds could have swayed in the way of Catone. So Camozzi would have to come out in the third round, be looking for the kill. Camozzi gets into a clinch position, a big knee, and a gash over the left eye of Nicotone is open as the blood is flowing. At one point, Catone goes to wipe the blood away from his eye. Right then, referee Dan Maragliata stops action, brings in the doctor. As soon as they get the blood cleaned away from his face, and you can see the damage that the cut has left, the referee waves off the bout. A third round TKO stoppage by doctor stoppage due to a cut. Chris Camozzi is the victor over Nicotone. The hometown crowd in New Jersey did not like that for Catone. They felt he was ahead. But when you look back at fight metric stats, it was actually 34 strikes to 14 strikes in favor of Camozzi. So even if we're saying that, a takedown is worth 10 strikes, which is absolutely ridiculous to me because a lot more strikes knock out people than takedowns, I still believe Camozzi then would have had a realistic edge then in the statistical category. So Camozzi rightly was ahead of that fight, gets a rightly deserved victory in a fight, whereas if they would have made it to the final bout in the MMA matchup version of it, Catone could have pulled it out for the takedowns, but the lack of striking and connecting, I think, really would have bothered me if I looked at these statistics afterwards. So Camozzi gets the win. We had thought Catone would get it. Camozzi, good knee, cut stops the fight. Now we move on. Next prelim, we're talking about Steven Siler versus Joey Gambino. I thought Siler would win. He'd be better in the clinch. He'd be able to get a submission, possibly using the length, being the longer fighter, and taking advantage off of Gambino's wrestling, being over-aggressive and getting to the ground. Well, what happened is we did see the submission. I thought it'd be a triangle or an arm bar, but after getting the fight to the ground, Gambino is caught in a guillotine attempt, and he is being pushed down so much. Siler flips over him. Gambino, a lot of pressure, and Steven Siler bloodied up from the blood of Gambino off of a knee strike. A brilliant performance, a first-round guillotine victory, and a statement again made by Steven Siler. 3-0 in the UFC now, coming off of the Ultimate Fighter alumni show. I don't think anyone saw that coming. Next matchup, we're talking about Rick the Horror Story versus Brock Jardine. We thought Story He'd just be with his back against the wall, his career on the line in the UFC. He was on the chopping block if he lost this one. They would come in, be more aggressive, be more technical, stick to his game plan. He gets a unanimous decision, takedowns, beating up Jardine in the boxing, 30-27 all the way across. Rick Story looks to be back on the right track. Next matchup we have Ramsey Najim versus CJ Keith. We would pick Najim to win this, having his more superior ground game. Thought he would beat up Keith, kind of in the essence of the same thing that happened to Danny Downs. It kind of was like that, but even more violent as Najim got it right to the ground. He was even taken down by Keith, gave up the mount, forced his way out of it, switched positions, getting on top of Keith, and then getting into his own mount position, and would not relinquish that until the TKO with the ground and pound. Ramsey Najim getting stronger every time out. Last of the prelims, and this fight probably should have been on the main card. Hatsu Hioki versus Ricardo Lamas. This fight was dictated by the fact that Lamas landed more strikes, and when Hioki went for takedowns, Lamas was going for submission, so kind of nullifying it, and Hioki just really holding position, and again, a lack of strikes goes against him. We predicted Hioki to win this because of his positional control, but finally, positional control doesn't mean everything. Striking, submission attempts to end the fight, that does matter, and Ricardo Lamas 29-28 across the board with an upset, ending the title contention hopes of Hatsu Hioki, who came over from Japan with tons of hype. Now we'll go back to the drawing board, as it looks like he has a weakness against wrestlers, or a weakness just for not enough striking, not being active enough. Now we go on to the main card. Start that off with Cub Swanson versus Ross Pearson. I thought the speed advantage that Swanson had would lead him to a split decision victory, outworking Pearson. Pearson, to my surprise, was getting in the clinch, working the takedowns, but speed does kill. Swanson in the second round lands a front kick, 2 right jabs, a left cross right on the jaw, drops Pearson. Cub Swanson, a second round TKO in memorable fashion. That was a great knockout by Swanson. He's realizing all that potential, and now 2-fight win streak in the UFC off of his loss from Ricardo Lamas. Move on now to a welterweight matchup, Brian Ebersole versus TJ Waldburger. This fight was what we expected. Ebersole's top control is wrestling in his takedowns, fighting off submissions from Waldburger, and then Ebersole landing the more devastating strikes across the board. 29-28, Brian Ebersole 4-0 in the UFC, and I think 11 consecutive wins overall. Now we go to the co-main event of the night. Stout, Spencer Fisher, looking for the conclusion to their trilogy. A striking slugfest, all-out war is what we were expecting. I thought that Stout, just being the younger, faster, he was longer, taller, he won this fight with the third round TKO. What does surprise us about this fight? Spencer's getting off more. Spencer Fisher looked revitalized, reborn, was working the striking. And then all of a sudden, Sam Stout does something that I never thought we would see. He turns into a wrestler, starts hitting takedowns, 5 consecutive takedowns through the 3 rounds, and really with a very close striking battle back and forth. The takedowns proved to be the difference in this matchup, going from the slugfest fight that we were looking for to the MMA matchup, as those takedowns do pay off. Sam Stout gets the unanimous decision victory over Spencer Fisher. And now we go to the main event of the night, Gray Maynard, Clay Guida. If you haven't heard already, we would pick Maynard by unanimous decision. Thought that if there was a way for Guida to win, it would be outworking, out-cardioing, out Gray Maynard. Maynard's cardio does hold up, looking tentative in the first 2 rounds, as Guida was using tons of movement, circling out, trying to be faster. The first 2 rounds were Guida frustrating, picking, popping, and hitting on Maynard. But as the 3rd round, 4th round, 5th round rolled around, you could see the frustration on Gray Maynard's face. He is flipping off Clay Guida. He is yelling and cursing in the cage. Let's fight. Guida's using movement. The story of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th round is just that Guida was using enough movement, didn't throw enough. Gray Maynard outstrikes him, and we end up with a split decision victory, 48-47, 47-48, and 48-47. Gray Maynard is victorious, a split decision. A lot of people are very mad with Clay Guida's performance. They thought he was running. It was worse than Carlos Condit. It was one of those worst things we ever saw. But I beg to differ. If you actually look at the fight metric numbers, Clay Guida threw 327 strikes. To throw 327 strikes in 25 minutes still means you were throwing. His 14 to 11% accuracy rate on connecting on strikes, that kills him, and that's how he loses the striking battle to win this fight. People like Kenny Florian, who was commentating, were advocating and very proud of the style of Clay Guida, not staying in the pocket, not exchanging bigger, heavier strikes with Gray Maynard. You'd have to be crazy to do that and not get knocked out, I think Kenny Florian said. Well, as Dana White says, it was the worst fight ever. I can't believe how bad that was. It was a horrible performance from Guida. He was a guy that always walked forward, always came forward, and now he's running around. This was horrible. So even from within the UFC themselves, they can't decide what they think of this performance. The commentators are saying it was a brilliant game plan enacted versus a heavy striking wrestler. Why would you stand in front of him? Well, Dana White saying, no, that's too much running. It was a horrible fight. And he said himself he didn't believe it was close. It was close. Gray Maynard only landed a few more strikes than Clay Guida that actually connected. Both of their percentages were horrible. And I beg to differ that Clay Guida, with a grappler, it's okay as long as the two participants in the matchup are touching, to be frustrated, for fans to be booing, for fans to want to see more action. When they're in the clinch, when a guy is laying praying on top, it's okay for the fans to be booing, but for the ref to not do a stand-up, for the action to not be commencing. But when a striker does their version of laying pay, which would be, rope a dope, would be to use movement and stay out of the way, not stay in front of a man, let him put in a double leg. Now you're avoiding the fight. Now you're not wanting to. I'd say you're just you're refusing to grapple as you're trying to strike, as you're using movement, like wrestlers refuse to strike when they're only attempting to grapple. It's just when you're running around, it looks more to boo, because instead of shooting it for a double with your knees touching the ground, they can't really hit you in the head anywhere. That's excusable. This is not. So a wrestler style of laying prey to make time go by, that's acceptable. Striking version, not acceptable is what we're learning. And then also, you got to give props up now to any guy, as we've heard it a million times over, that can win a fight off his back. Because as you hear John Anik say on the UFC cast, it's so hard nowadays in 2012 to win a fight off your back. So I'm almost proposing then, guys that win with arm bars, with triangles, with submissions off their back should get 2 or 3 wins, because this is such a hard thing. The judges believe it is nearly impossible. You cannot win. They must score the person on top winning. They are winning, even though we've seen a lot of submissions where the guy on the bottom pulls it out, which tells me that there is not a distinct advantage. They're telling me there is, without a 1,000,000% doubt, that you have lost the fight if you're on your back. So when you're on your back to a guy that's not really being active, you're frustrated, you're gassing yourself out, it's taking the energy out of you having that man riding you. That is acceptable in mixed martial arts. But when you're being frustrated, running around, exerting energy after yourself, not being able to get off your offense, when you're chasing a guy in the stand-up, that is unacceptable. But when you're on the bottom in this situation, it is acceptable. It's these little nuances of mixed martial arts when the sport comes back to be a sport that they don't like it. When you're wrestling and you're scoring points with the takedown, the sport is a beautiful thing to people who watch you advocate it. But when you're scoring points by making the other guy miss, by being elusive, it's a horrible thing to see. So we're all wondering, what is mixed martial arts? Is it a fight? Is it glorified wrestling? Is it a point-scoring sport? But the UFC show on FX4 has done one big thing, at least. It has raised a lot of questions about who knows what MMA is. And what we do know for sure is that at least the athletic commissions believe that the referee and the judges who support the wrestlers believe they know what MMA is. I believe watching the guy strike is watching a fight. So this has been Cage Minds. I went off on a rant now on our results show. I am sorry for this. Leave us a comment, subscribe to the videos, hit us up on Facebook or Twitter, Uncage the Warrior Within Yourself. Thank you for watching. Have a good night.